What are we to make of Yoko Ono? Her late husband once famously referred to her as the world's most famous unknown artist. Everybody knows her name, but nobody knows what she does. Indeed, most of the public perception of Ono has less to do with her work and more to do with her as a series of contradictions. She is simultaneously seen as too feminine, yet also too loud and confrontational, incomprehensibly ugly, yet also somehow a seductive temptress, and a dangerous political radical and countercultural figure who's simultaneously a gold-digging grifter with no reason to believe the things she does. It's sad that this largely untrue narrative about Yoko Ono and her relation to her famous late husband is all the general public know about Ono, because her life, her philosophy, her art, and the way she fuses the three raise important questions and conversations about society that are as relevant as ever, especially now society begins to reassess the history of anti-Asian racism in wake of the racist fear-mongering surrounding the coronavirus. Yoko Ono was born on the 18th of February, 1933 in Tokyo, Japan. For a variety of reasons, her life was different from that of most other people in Japan at the time. Chief among these was that her parents, Eisuke and Isoko Ono, had married for love, which was uncommon for a couple in 1930s Japan. Even more uncommon was that Isoko was a Buddhist while Eisuke was a Christian, a minority faith in a Japan that was becoming increasingly isolationist and anti-Christian. Eisuke was also a banker, and 2 weeks before Yoko's birth, he had been transferred to a bank in San Francisco. Yoko wouldn't meet her father until she was 2 years old, and her family traveled to California to be with him. But Yoko's life in America was far from perfect. Increasing conflict between Japan and China that would eventually become the Pacific theater of the Second World War meant that there was increasing hostility towards Japanese people living in America, combined with the already existing anti-Asian racism in the United States. Watching movies made by and for a predominantly white American audience meant that the only people Yoko saw who looked like her were villains.
I remember being in film theaters where the baddies were always Asian. When the lights went up, I thought, am I a baddie too?
If she traveled only a couple of blocks away from her neighborhood, other children would throw stones at her because she was Japanese. In 1937, Yoko and her family, now including her baby brother Keisuke, were transferred back to Japan. In 1940, Yoko and her family moved to New York City, but the following year, which would famously end with the Japanese military's attack on Pearl Harbor, they would move back to Tokyo. But Yoko couldn't escape her status as an other in Japan either. The wartime hypernationalism meant that Yoko, who adopted many American mannerisms off-putting to her Japanese peers, and whose mother had her dress in skirts and blouses cut in the American style, constantly had her loyalty questioned by her classmates. Her peers would tease her for her presumed Americanization, saying that she smelled like butter, and accusing her of being an American spy because she didn't sing the Japanese national anthem fast enough. Yoko's constant outsider status, too Japanese for America and too American for Japan, and the duality of her upbringing and Christian Buddhist heritage would become a large influence on Yoko's art and philosophy. But the direct impacts of the war would have an even greater impact on the way in which her adolescent mind began to view the world. In early March of 1945, the US military started a bombing raid of Tokyo that remains the single most destructive bombing raid in history. Under Operation Meeting House, 2,000 US tons of incendiary bombs were dropped on Tokyo, resulting in the incineration of almost 16 square miles in and around the largely wooden city, and the deaths of 80,000 to 130,000 Japanese civilians.
I was in Tokyo during the Second World War. In the middle of the night, we were woken up to go down into the shelter while the B-29s firebombed our city. It was frightening to see fire burning down the houses around us. Eventually, we, children, were evacuated to the country. The food was scarce. I remember we were always hungry. It was not just food. There was a shortage of everything, even toilet paper. So we managed with what we had and became rather inventive. Those experiences of the early days cast a long shadow in my life.
Yoko and her family, now including baby Setsuko, managed to survive the raids by hiding in the bomb shelter into which their basement had been converted, and after it, they, like many other families, decided to flee Tokyo. But they wouldn't leave their hardships with them in Tokyo. For the rest of the war, they would experience famine and would be forced to sell many of their clothes, possessions, and family heirlooms to survive. To comfort her famished younger brother, Yoko would play a game in which they would imagine menus together while lying on their backs looking at the sky. Japan would surrender on the 15th of August, 1945, but not before the US military infamously used atomic weapons on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which immediately killed an estimated 80,000 people and 40,000 people in each city respectively. The city of Hiroshima would later estimate that upwards of 200,000 people were killed in connection with the bombing, including the effects of fallout and radiation sickness. The bomb also incinerated 90% of the city, and created temperatures so high that it burned imprints of the shadows of buildings and people cast by the bomb's light into the city. In his famous New Yorker article turned book, John Hersey vividly describes the destruction brought about in Hiroshima after the use of the atomic bomb against the city, writing,
"The eyebrows of some were burned off and skin hung from their faces and hands. Others, because of pain, held their arms up as if carrying something in both hands. Some were vomiting as they walked. Many were naked or in shreds of clothing. On some undressed bodies, the burns had made patterns of undershirt straps and suspenders, and on the skin of some women, since white repelled the heat from the bomb and dark clothes absorbed it and conducted it to the skin, the shapes of flowers they had on their kimonos." The flash of the bomb had discolored concrete to a light reddish tint, had scaled off the surface of granite, and had scorched certain other types of building material, and that consequently the bomb had, in some places, left prints of the shadows that had been cast by its light.
Alongside the rest of the war, reading about the horrors of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would have a profound impact on Yoko and the way in which she views the world. Even before the war, Yoko was shuttled between Japan and America, which, when combined with her family having to flee her home city and sell their belongings, taught her that
nothing was permanent. You don't want to possess anything that is dear to you because you might lose it. So I became extremely disinterested in anything material.
and inspired the focus in her work on a Zen-like acceptance of mortality and the transience of existence. Furthermore, Yoko's first-hand experience with war at an early age would have a tremendous influence on the lifelong pacifism in Yoko's art and philosophy. In her 1966 piece, White Chess Set, Ono invites participants to play a game of chess in which pieces from both sides are painted white, turning the game on its head by pointing out its bases in a black versus white, us versus them competition-driven dynamic, and challenging participants to view those that they see as enemies as indistinguishable from themselves. Of it, Yoko said,
"It's confusing which one is yours, and you start to really understand that it doesn't matter. We're together. We're on the same side. You realize that it's not important to win."
In her performance of Shadow Piece during the same year's Destruction in Art Symposium, DIA, that took place in London, instead of the very literal interpretation of the destruction theme that many of the other artists at the symposium took, Ono alluded to the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by tracing the bodies of 20 participants on a long, continuous piece of cloth, calling to mind the previously mentioned Hiroshima shadows. This connection to the war was nailed home by Yoko's choice of location, London's Free School Playground, a strip of land bombed during the Blitz and still littered by debris. Instead of destroying something herself in her piece, like most other artists, she chose to make a poignant statement about people's destruction of each other. In 1969's Bed piece, Yoko and her husband turned their honeymoon into a happening, which used the media attention of their honeymoon as a way to promote peace and an end to the Vietnam War by having their marriage symbolize a union between the dichotomy of East and West, the same dichotomy that fueled much of the Cold War. In her 1973 song, Now or Never, Yoko much more directly addressed the Vietnam War.
Are we gonna keep sending our youth to war? Are we gonna keep scarring rice fields and infants? Are we gonna keep watching dead bodies over dinner? Are we gonna be known as the century that kills?
As well as greed and the often violent response to difference.
Are we gonna keep digging oil wells and gold? Are we gonna keep shooting the ones that tries to change? Are we gonna keep thinking it won't happen to us? Are we gonna be known as the century that kills?
Encouraging people to work for a better future.
People of America, please listen to your soul. We can change the times to century of hope.
Yoko has been explicit about the effect that her childhood in Japan during the war has had on her pacifism. In her 2005 United Nations address, as a child of Asia, Yoko outlines her pacifist and environmental concerns for the welfare of the planet, tracing them back to her childhood in Japan, pointing out how atomic weapons pose a threat to everybody.
When I was 12 years old, in 1945, the cities of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and their people were devastated by the atomic bomb. The war was pretty much at the end by then, but the unbearable sufferings of the hibakushas did not end there. In fact, their long and excruciating, painful journey had begun then, and is still continuing to this day over half a century later. It is the suffering of a lifetime and more. In fact, it affected all of us on this planet. Nuclear damage does not disappear, it circulates and stays. Why make it even harder for this planet by continuing to increase the production of the most dangerous weapon known to us? Are we doing this to use the bomb? If we are, we must be crazy. Since the world is one body, we cannot drop a bomb far enough from ourselves to not get affected by its consequence. In fact, if we drop a bomb anywhere, we are dropping it on ourselves.
Yoko has continued this pacifism in her art as recently as 2019, in which she debuted her sculpture, Add Color, Refugee Boat, in Manhattan's Seaport District, the same place where some of the first Europeans arrived at New York Harbor several centuries ago. The sculpture consists of a simple rowboat in an all-white room in which visitors were encouraged to paint messages of solidarity throughout using spray cans. Yoko's concern for the plight of refugees is partially based on her experiences during the war, as well as her experiences as an immigrant.
I didn't have the refugee experience, but I felt I could have had it, as an Asian, and as a woman who spoke out.
But Yoko would connect the horrors of war she saw as a child and her philosophy of pacifism to more than just literal war. In 1994, Yoko was asked to write a few songs for the play Hiroshima. The tracks she wrote for it, I'm Dying, and Kurushi.
苦しいマミ苦しいの苦しいの
Were also released on her 1995 album Rising, and are beautiful and haunting portrayals of the pain and suffering of those affected by the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Kurushi literally translates to tormented or suffocating. But to Yoko, they began to represent more than that, as she explained in the CD's liner notes.
I realized there was a striking similarity in what I went through during the war and what I am going through now. This city is a war zone, and I now have many friends around me who are facing slow death from AIDS. They are suffering low white blood cell counts exactly as the Hiroshima victims were. I am living amongst my suffering friends, listening to them talk about their fear of death, sometimes jokingly, and other times in anger. I live through their nightmares, not daring to voice my own.
In connecting the tragedies of the AIDS epidemic and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Yoko speaks not just to the literal imagery of victims' bodies being ravaged by cancers and other diseases brought about by lowered immune systems, but also to the cruelty of governments that allowed them to happen and the dehumanization of their victims. There's a deep sense of irony in that the government that incinerated 2 cities and caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians to show off its technological superiority over fascism is the same government that, some 40 years later, would essentially ignore a massive epidemic and cut funding to its own Center for Disease Control because the predominantly gay and non-white population suffering from that epidemic were seen as undesirable. What's more, for the victims of these tragedies, the actual illnesses they had weren't the only things they suffered from. Survivors of the atomic bombings, whom the Japanese refer to as hibakusha, and their children were and are victims of social and economic discrimination because of a fear that their illnesses are contagious and make them unreliable employees. A similar stigma happened, and, to a far lesser extent, continues to happen, to people with AIDS, who had to deal both with the view of the disease as the gay plague, as well as the widespread hysteria over the disease and discrimination against people who had it, because of the fear that just being nearby someone with AIDS would put you at risk. I'm sure the similarities between these two tragedies and the current pandemic we found ourselves in which the gross inaction, or worse, of governments has allowed a virus to spread, and along with it, racist fear-mongering about the part of the world it originated in, aren't lost on Yoko. Because of her experience during the Second World War, for the rest of her life, she became disillusioned with war, the governments that cause it, and the dehumanization of other people that allows it. And she wasn't alone in this. This dissatisfaction with the powers that be and a deep anguish over the death and destruction they caused informed much of the post-war atmosphere. In the bleak shadow of the war, it became increasingly difficult to see meaning in the world, and the philosophy of existentialism gained significant popularity. Post-war works from Western philosophers like Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Heidegger are probably the most well-known from this period, but the philosophy was also prevalent in post-war Japan in works such as Osamu Dazai's No Longer Human and Kobo Abe's The Woman in the Dunes. However, simultaneously, the war coming to an end created an atmosphere of optimism and a commitment to further freedom and liberation for many. Leftist ideas of equality and anti-militarism that had been suppressed during the war resurfaced, and Japan saw a newfound commitment to feminism after the 1946 constitution allowed women to vote. Because of her time spent studying philosophy at Gakushuin University as the first woman to do so, Yoko was entrenched in these post-war philosophies and ideologies, and so were the American avant-garde she would eventually find herself working alongside. Just as the First World War coming to an end resulted in the rise of Dada, a modern art movement that used absurdity as a protest against the logic and reason of the materialist bourgeois establishment that started the war. The period following the Second World War saw the rise of a loose movement of anti-establishment avant-garde artists, chief among them being George Maciunas and John Cage. Like Dada before them, they were critical of both the establishment that started the war and the artistic establishment, and were dedicated to seeking radical new methods of artistic expression to demonstrate that anyone could become an artist. This search led them to the world of Asian religion and philosophy, which they saw as a counter to the Western rationalism of the bourgeois establishment. In Maciunas's Fluxus Manifesto, he proclaims that this movement of art must work to
purge the world of bourgeois sickness, intellectual, professional, and commercialized culture. Purge the world of dead art, imitation, artificial art, abstract art, illusionistic art, mathematical art. Purge the world of Europanism.
Cage was equally influenced by Asian religion, especially the focus of Zen Buddhism on awareness of the present moment as an important part of achieving enlightenment. Cage's compositions utilized chance operations and environmental sounds, which he encouraged his audiences to view as music in and of themselves because,
in this way, art becomes important as a means to make one aware of one's actual environment.
Fusing art and life in such a way that the two are one and the same, meaning that everyone is an artist and the elitist artistic establishment is rendered obsolete. Yoko came from a different background than these American artists. Growing up in Japan meant that she didn't have to seek out Buddhist ideas or Asian aesthetic traditions. She grew up alongside them and absorbed them. So, when she became a part of the American avant-garde scene and befriended Maciunas, she was able to use this influence in an environment where it wasn't out of place, but still maintain a unique perspective on said influence, allowing her to further influence other artists in the scene. Many of Yoko's art pieces are directly inspired by Japanese cultural traditions. One such work was her performance of Pea-Piece, during which she threw peas at the audience, reminiscent of the Japanese festival Setsubun, which people celebrate by tossing fortune beans out of homes and temples as a way of warding off the devil and bringing good luck. Another such work is her 1961 piece Painting to Hammer a Nail, which instructs audience members to hammer a nail in the canvas and tie a hair around it. The act of tying a hair around the nail was inspired by the courtyards of the Japanese temples Yoko visited as a child, which would have visitors write prayers or wishes on slips of paper and tie them to the branches of a tree.
I used to go to a temple and write out a wish on a piece of thin paper and tie it in a knot around the branch of a tree. Trees and temple courtyards were always filled with people's wish knots, which looked like white flowers blossoming from afar.
To Yoko, these trees, which represented the collective efforts, hopes, and dreams of all kinds of different people, were a work of art in and of themselves, and she would later replicate them with 1996's Wish Tree, which encouraged audience members to write a wish on a piece of paper and tie it to the branches of a potted tree. But more than just inspiring a few specific pieces, Yoko's experience with Buddhism and Japanese aesthetic traditions influenced her approach to art and the subjects and philosophies she would explore in her art. Perhaps the most obvious place to start is her focus on the transience of being and mortality. This focus clearly owes a lot to Buddhist ideas about the cyclical nature of life, death, and reincarnation, and the debt to these beliefs is especially evident in pieces such as Exit, an installation piece that consists of 100 simple wooden coffins, 60 for men, 30 for women, and 10 for children, all of which have a single tree sprouting from them. Just as much as this forest of trees evokes feelings of pain and sadness surrounding the death they came from, it also evokes a sense of hope at the sight of life and nature renewing themselves. However, just as much as Yoko's focus on mortality is influenced by ideas of reincarnation, it's also influenced by the Japanese aesthetic tradition of mano no aware, which refers to the belief that an awareness of the impermanence of things greatens your appreciation for them, making them all the more beautiful. We can see this throughout Yoko's work, whether it's in 1955's Lighting piece, in which she would light a match and watch the flame go out, which she equated to the fleeting nature of life, helping calm her nerves. 1966's Apple, in which she put an apple on a pedestal which would slowly decompose during exhibitions, turning the fruit's usual appearance in art in the context of still lifes, where it exists frozen in time in a state of eternal freshness, on its head. Or 1966's Film Number 1, a film version of Matchpiece that uses slow-motion photography as a conceptual element to further make the viewers aware of the passing of time. Another Japanese aesthetic tradition informing Yoko's work is the idea of ma, the concept of the necessary void between all things that informs the minimalism and use of negative space in much of Japanese art. Most of Yoko's art is especially minimalist. Her conceptual pieces often consist of only a few objects for viewers to interact with. Her instructional pieces and poems, inspired by both haiku and zen koan, are often only a few lines long, made all the more powerful by their brevity. And her experimental music opts for wordless vocals, improvisational instrumentals, and occasional uses of musique concrète. Yoko herself would later point out that her experimental music compositions, utilizing instructions and minimal notation, resembled the scores that her mother Isoko, who understood Japanese singing and musical scores, had read when she was a child. Perhaps the best example of this minimalism is the track 2 Minute Silence off of 1969's Unfinished Music No. 2, Life with the Lions, which, as its title suggests, is 2 minutes of unadulterated silence. Ostensibly a treatment of John Cage's 433, in which a performer sits at a piano and doesn't play a single note for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the track also speaks to another aspect of ma, the view of it as the emptiness full of possibilities. Immediately following the track Baby's Heartbeat, which is a looped recording of her miscarried baby's heartbeat. The silence has a somber mood and evokes the possibilities of what could have been. The idea of ma as an emptiness full of possibilities informs almost all of Yoko's work, which often uses audience participation to further the Flux's goal of demonstrating that anyone can be an artist. This can be seen in her use of instructional scores that tell people how to carry out an art piece rather than simply doing it herself. Her incorporation of pieces of the audience in Painting to Hammer a Nail and Wish Tree inspired by Japanese temples, and the concept behind her Indica Gallery show subtitled Unfinished Paintings by Yoko Ono, and the unfinished music duology being that the art was left unfinished by her, so the audience could finish it in their own minds. By leaving things unfinished, she creates a space of absence, or ma, that the audience can fill with their own concepts, ideas, emotions, and beliefs, proving that any one of them is just as much an artist as she is. This inventive new strategy would be adopted by George Maciunas, and in turn the rest of Fluxus, and inspire the famous conceit behind her late husband's 1971 song, Imagine, which he would claim was inspired by her Cloud piece. Alongside the concept of ma, this aspect of audience interaction with art was influenced by the Buddhist idea that the true nature of all beings is interconnectedness. This belief can be seen in the meditation practice of Tonglen, Tibetan for giving and taking, in which a person will visualize themselves taking in the suffering of others and exchanging it for their own well-being. And by exchanging self and other, they begin to see both as interconnected and equal. The influence of this practice can be seen in Yoko's 1964 work, Cut Piece, in which she would sit on the floor, motionless and silent, while audience members were instructed to take the scissors placed next to her and cut away pieces of her clothing, until all her clothes had been stripped away. Yoko has said that the piece was inspired by
the Zen tradition of doing the thing that is most embarrassing for you to do and seeing what you come up with and how you deal with it.
And that, rather than seeing it as the audience's taking a part of her, she saw it as her willingly giving up a part of herself to her audience.
I wanted people to take whatever they wanted to. so it was very important to say you can cut wherever you want to. It is a form of giving that has a lot to do with Buddhism, a form of total giving as opposed to reasonable giving.
The connections to the Buddhist view of interconnectedness and Tonglen are clear. She is giving both a part of her clothing and a part in the performance to the members of the audience, fusing artist and audience so they become indistinguishable, and showing that underneath all that clothing, we're the same. Another concept informing much of Yoko's work is the idea underpinning much of Chinese philosophy and religion of a cosmic duality of two opposing energies, known as yin and yang. Very briefly summarizing, the concept of yin-yang involves the belief that the universe and everything in it is made of two diametrically opposing forces: yin, inward energy, viewed as feminine, cold, and dark, and yang, outward energy, viewed as masculine, hot, and bright. While these two forces are in opposition to another, they are interconnected and rely on one another to exist, and the necessity of the balance of yin and yang informs much of traditional Chinese medicine. Yoko has invoked the concept of yin-yang in her art on several occasions. While writing about the songs Airmail and You on her 1971 album Fly, Yoko stated,
Airmail is yang and you is yin. Airmail expresses the delicateness of male. You expresses the aggressiveness of female. You has all the feminine resentment, moan, and animal satisfaction in it.
In making her musical exploration of yin, commonly thought of as feminine energy, aggressive and assertive, and her musical exploration of yang, commonly thought of as a masculine energy, passive and delicate, Yoko uses one of the aspects of yin-yang, that the balance of yin and yang sometimes exists within the concepts of yin and yang themselves, so yin elements can contain parts of yang and vice versa, to subvert traditional gender roles and the more patriarchal views of the yin-yang dichotomy. Yoko used this feminist interpretation of the yin-yang dichotomy again in the song Yang Yang on her 1973 album Approximately Infinite Universe. The song follows a powerful man who objectifies women,
Yang Yang rips his women down to the bones. I own you, so give us a song.
and abuses men.
Yang Yang sends his men pebbles and stones.
The lyrics also extend an edge of sympathy to the titular character, using symbolic imagery to show how he feels trapped and unable to communicate,
Yang Yang's born with a funko on his neck.
and how he suffers from self-hatred.
I hate you, where did it go wrong? Yang Yang goes talking to himself on the phone.
At the climax of the song, Yoko urges him to
And leave your private institution, get down to real communication. Leave your scene of destruction, and join us in revolution.
In naming the song and character Yang Yang after the masculine energy of Yang, Yoko paints the destructive and toxically masculine behavior of the character and the institutions he represents as a result of a metaphorically sick society that organizes itself around men, causing an excess of yang that harms men and women alike. While it is influenced by yin-yang, the song also owes a lot to Yoko's essay for the New York Times titled The Feminization of Society, which can be found on the inner gatefold of the album, in which Yoko argues that instead of women becoming a part of the pre-existing male-dominated social structure, the aim of the feminist movement should be restructuring society in a way that reflects attributes typically dismissed as feminine, such as empathy and love.
In the last 2,000 years, men have repeatedly shown us failure in their method of running the world. Instead of falling into the same trap that men fell into, women can offer something that the society never had before because of male dominance. That is the feminine direction. What we can do is to take the society which contains both masculine and feminine characteristics and bring out the more feminine nature in society, rather than the masculine one now at work as a negative force. We must make more positive usage of the feminine tendencies of the society which, up to now, have been either suppressed or dismissed as something harmful, impractical, irrelevant, and ultimately, I am proposing the feminization of society, the use of feminine tendencies as a positive force to change the world. We can change with feminine intelligence and awareness into a basically organic, non-competitive society that is based on love rather than reasoning. The result will be balance, peace, and contentment. We can evolve rather than revolt, come together rather than claim independence, and feel rather than think. These are characteristics that are considered feminine and which men despise in women. But have men done so well by avoiding the development of these characteristics within themselves?
Because of the way she sees similarities between the patriarchal structure of society and an excess of yang, she's able to examine ways that the patriarchy harms men as well as women, which she explores in songs like I Want My Love to Rest Tonight.
Sisters, let's not blame our men too much. We know they're trying their best. We know their fear and loneliness. They can do no more, no less. They were told by us to get ahead. Be gentle and tender, yet hard and strong. Nothing short of a living God. Nothing short of James Bond. If you all knew that no one's to be ashamed, but that society is to be blamed, we could then come together again and direct our energy towards changing the world.
This sense of interconnected dualism influenced Yoko's philosophy beyond just the way in which she approached feminism. In 1955, Yoko wrote a surreal little short story titled Of a Grapefruit in the World of Park, in which a grapefruit left on a park table is discovered by two children, who decide to eat it only because the wastebasket is too full to throw it away. The fruit is initially seen by them as
A greenish-yellow thing with wrinkles all around it.
but
After all the outside skin was peeled, the grapefruit suddenly looked fresh and orange.
Yoko would return to the symbol of the grapefruit again and again, making it the title of her 1964 book of instructional poems, and adapting the short story to her first musical performance in 1961. To Yoko, the grapefruit seemed like a hybrid of an orange and a lemon, and came to represent the hybridity of her Japanese-American identity, and her fusion of Japanese aesthetics with the American avant-garde. Overlooked and underappreciated, the grapefruit is a symbol of a duality of identities, made all the better for being combined. Throughout Yoko's work, duality and balance, both in the structure of society and in individual identity, are qualities to strive for and to be proud of, not avoided and shunned like we're taught to. And I guess that brings us to the elephant in the room. You see, earlier when I was discussing Cut Piece, I explained it as a compassionate work inspired by Buddhism, in which an artist gives everything she has to her audience, and in doing so reveals the deep interconnectedness of all human beings. While there is truth to that analysis of the piece, there's another analysis of it that I think is equally true. One that sees it as a work about othering, the male gaze, the objectification of women, and sexual violence. In the piece, Yoko, emotionless and unmoving, stays sitting while members of her audience slowly strip away her clothes. Hesitant at first, as she becomes more exposed, more objectified, the cutters became more aggressive. In a 1965 performance of the piece, one man went as far as cutting Ono's bra strap, and, allegedly, another man was heard to say, quote, "Come on, make a piece for Playboy, Richard," end quote. While all of this happened, Yoko remained motionless and silent, seeming less like a person with thoughts and feelings and more like a sculpture or a piece of fancy furniture. Using her audience's own hands, Yoko demonstrated the quiet violence and objectification that women, especially public-facing women, are forced to endure. When the piece was performed in Japan, the audience members were mostly discreet about cutting away her clothes. But when she performed the piece in New York and London, the audience members were more violent. Given the piece's roots in Buddhist thought, it's easy to attribute this entirely to cultural differences. But I think it's just as likely that it's because it's easier for people to see someone who doesn't look like them as an object than someone who looks like them. There is a long history of Asian women being objectified and stereotyped as exotic and passive. Afong Moy, the first Chinese woman in America, was brought to New York in 1834, where she was exhibited as a representative of an exoticized, Orientalist view of Chinese culture. First for the Carnes brothers, who used her to sell goods imported from China, and later for P.T. Barnum, who exhibited her alongside other Chinese women as exotic curios. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, most of the Chinese women and girls in America were kidnapped or bought from their homes and taken to San Francisco, where they were forced into the sex trade. Forced to sign contracts they didn't understand, most agreed to 4 to 6 years of slavery to pay off their passage, but few survived it, their bodies ravaged by venereal disease and put out on the street to die. The Chinese women who fell victim to this practice were seen by many as exotic temptresses who were spreading disease, destroying family values, and lowering property values. And this backlash eventually led to one of America's first immigration laws, the Page Act. While the actual text of the law only prohibits the recruitment of workers from Asian countries who are not brought to the country of their own volition, or who are brought for lewd or immoral purposes, in practice, the law is used to prevent Chinese women from entering the United States at all. This would eventually lead to even harsher restrictions, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned all immigration from China. While these laws did eventually go away, the racist and misogynistic attitudes they came from and helped foster didn't. Throughout the 20th century, the stereotype of the sexually submissive Asian woman would find a new life in Hollywood movies like You Only Live Twice, which tended to place these portrayals within the context of Western militarism because of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, reigniting the trope's ties to Western imperialism. Alongside the stereotype of the sexually submissive Asian woman, there exists the stereotype of women who refuse to conform to that stereotype, the Dragon Lady. Referring to an Asian woman who is powerful, assertive, and in charge of her own sexual agency, dragon ladies are often thought to be conniving, gold-digging, and to take advantage of Western men. The term itself originates from a comic character in the 1930s, but the trope was popular in much of cinema of the early to mid-20th century. The history of this racism in the 1960s, as well as the present racism due to the Vietnam War, in the United States meant that Yoko Ono didn't stand a chance. An Asian woman was supposed to shut up and be the exotic bride of a white man, not make art that questions violence, the objectification of women, and the very ways in which art and music should be constructed. In Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning, Kathy Park Hong writes that avant-garde art is about defying standards and initiating a precedent that ultimately liberates art from itself. Stripped of the artwork, all we are left with is the artist's activities. The problem is that history has to recognize the artist's transgressions as art, which is then dependent on the artist's access to power. A female artist rarely gets away with it. A black artist rarely gets away with it. The bad boy artist can do whatever he wants because of who he is. This double standard can easily be seen in the reaction to Yoko's art, which is seen as pretentious and phony, and her music, which is seen as horrendous screeching, while the equally experimental work of her peers and contemporaries like John Cage, Can, and even Jimi Hendrix and early Pink Floyd is celebrated and revered. Of course, most people who know the name Yoko Ono don't know her primarily for her art, instead knowing her through her famous husband and hating her for breaking up his band, Nirvana. The idea that she broke up the band is blatantly untrue, and has been refuted both by members of the band itself and by retrospectives by modern music journalists. It's very telling how the breaking up of a band composed of 4 white men is blamed not on any member of the band, but on an Asian woman one of them was married to. The popularity of this myth speaks to the vitriol Yoko faced as an assertive Asian woman after meeting her famous husband and entering the public eye in the 1960s, a time of increased anti-Asian sentiment in America due to the Vietnam War. News coverage of her leaned in on the scheming, oriental, dragon lady stereotype, placing exaggerated importance on her interest in guidance systems like tarot and astrology. During the bed-in in Canada, conservative cartoonist and newspaper columnist Al Capp repeatedly referred to her as Madame New and told her to go to Saigon.
I'm delighted to have met you, Madame New. And JC, I couldn't...
Esquire went as far as publishing an article mocking her Japanese accent, the title of which referred to her as her husband's, quote, excrusive gloopy, end quote. In the supposedly anti-establishment atmosphere of the 1960s, it was easy for people to sing the words, love is all you need, but when it came to actually extending that love to an Asian woman, they fell back into establishment ideas of racism and misogyny. To Yoko's credit, she handled this vitriolic racism with incredible strength. Not only did she continue making art and music, she directly confronted it in her art. At 1973's first International Feminist Conference, Yoko explained the effect this vitriol had on her.
What happened to me was that I was living as an artist and had relative freedom as a woman and was considered a bitch in this society. Since I met art, I was upgraded into a witch, and I was... And I think that that's very flattering. The whole society started to attack me, and the whole society wished me dead. I started to accumulate a tremendous amount of guilt complex, And in result of that, I started to stutter. And I consider myself a very eloquent woman and also an attractive woman all my life. And suddenly, because I was associated with knowledge that I was considered an ugly woman, ugly Jap, who took your monument or something away from you. And that's when I realized how hard it is for women. If I can start to stutter, being a strong woman, and having lived 30 years by then, learn to stutter in 3 years of being treated as such, it is a very hard road.
And how it inspired her to write Coffin Car, a song using the metaphor of death, or riding in a coffin car, to represent the societal pressure women face to give up their own lives and devote themselves entirely to men.
Half the world is dead anyway, the other half is asleep, and life is killing her, telling her to join the dead. So every day she likes to ride a coffin car, a flower-covered coffin car, pretending she was dead.
Yoko would also return to the idea of the vitriol against her as a witch hunt in Yes, I'm a Witch, a feminist anthem in which she loudly proclaims that she won't let the misogyny of society beat her down.
Yes, I'm a bitch. I'm a bitch. I don't care what you say. My voice is real. My words speak truth. I don't fit in your ways. I'm not gonna die for you. You might as well face the truth. I'm gonna stick around for quite a while.
Yoko would reclaim the Dragon Lady perception of her in much the same way with the cover art to her 2001 album, Blueprint for a Sunrise, in which she's dressed as Chinese Empress Zhu Xi. Unfortunately, while Yoko Ono was able to handle the racist and misogynistic public display of hatred against her, she wasn't the only one affected by it. In a society where the press and general public feels comfortable publicly making racial slurs and misogynistic remarks against a famous Asian woman simply for existing, Asian women, and women more generally, who aren't famous, aren't going to feel very comfortable or free. And this effect was only exacerbated when the public hatred of her became so intense that to call someone Yoko Ono became a misogynistic slight. In Minor Feelings, Hong explains how this insult was particularly weaponized against Asian women, writing, "There was a time, from the late 60s until the 80s, when every East Asian woman with long hair was catcalled or dismissed as Yoko Ono. When I was 14, I took guitar lessons, and my teacher's friend, a baby boomer, remarked that I looked so much like Yoko Ono with my guitar. I was confused. Yoko Ono didn't play guitar, she was the wife of a guitar player, and I was insulted. Yoko Ono was old. This was in the 90s, when Yoko Ono had already faded from notoriety as the Dragon Lady who broke up her husband's band. As an insult, Yoko's name serves as a reminder of the way society views assertive women, and Asian women in general, weaponizing the vitriol against her against any woman who might be inspired to follow in her footsteps. In effect, it is akin to leaving the immolated corpse of the witch on display in the town center, to make sure that women know where their place in society is. Yoko's art often works to hold a mirror up to its audiences, sometimes literally, like in Box of Smile. Of her use of audience interaction with her pieces, she once said,
What I'm trying to do is make something happen by throwing a pebble into the water and creating ripples. I don't want to control the ripples.
For Yoko, an audience's reaction to a piece is a work of art in and of itself, and says just as much, if not more than, the work of art that elicited the reaction. In much the same way, the societal reaction to Yoko Ono tells us a lot about society. Unfortunately, it reminds us of a lot of the bad in society, the history of misogyny and racism in America, and a broader tendency towards dehumanization and violence. The same issues that tragically resulted in the deaths of 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, in the Atlanta spa shootings, as well as a general rise in anti-Asian hate crimes around the world. But Yoko's art also reminds us of the potential for good in the world. Drawing from the Buddhist tradition of peace pagodas, monuments built to inspire peace and unity across the world, Yoko's Strawberry Fields, a garden in Central Park honoring her late husband's murder, and Imagine Peace Tower, a conceptual tower in Iceland made of a beam of light, serve as monuments to the pacifist cause she's been dedicated to her whole life. Throughout her art, her music, and her life, Yoko Ono pushes us to question the way things are, to imagine a better world, and to dream, because
Dream alone is only a dream.
In the evening, I watch the city lights from my apartment that hangs in the air and become overwhelmed with the incredibility of it all. Behind each shining dot, there is a room, an apartment, a person or people who are all having a life show of their own. Every person's life can be a book thicker than an encyclopedia, and still you couldn't explain all that they took to survive. I would probably not meet even 1,000th of those people. The odds of not meeting in this life are so great that every meeting is like a miracle. It's a wonder that we don't make love to every single person we meet in our life. We take meetings like riding a cab. You know that you would probably never meet the driver again. Yet if the car crashed, that driver is the person you are going to die with. In fact, your life is in the driver's hands while you're in the car. But when you get to the destination, you give a bit of metal and slam the door behind. When I'm on stage, I freak out thinking about the strangeness of the gathering. In 4 hours or so, all the seats would be empty again. In 10 years, nobody would remember that these people were here, or it wouldn't matter to anybody. In 100 years, they would all be dead. People say that for the last 5 years, I had been a hate object of the world. It was sort of fashionable to put me down. You don't hurt me though, because I know you and I love you. I can take hatred because I don't believe that people are capable of real hate. We are too lonely for that. We vanish too quickly for that. Do you ever hate a cloud? How could anyone hate people who are on their deathbeds? That's where we are all since the day of birth. Hate is just an awkward way of love. We spit on people when we want to kiss them. We hit them when we only want to be held. We talk about misunderstanding and hurt. But how could we hurt or misunderstand each other when we are so much alike, when we are the only people who share this world for this decade, this year, this day, under the same sky? Deep down inside and far outside, none of us really misunderstand anything. We don't miss a trick. We know, but we all pretend to ourselves and to others that we don't. Next time you meet a foreigner, remember it's only like a window with a little different shape to it, and the person who's sitting inside is you. All we have to do is admire each other and love each other for 24 hours a day until we vanish. That's what we really want to do. The rest is just foreplay to get to that. In my mind, I'm really in an eternal sphinx. Shake my hand for what it's worth. There is a wind that never dies.